27th, 2004, and we're at the home of Edwin Chertok in Laconia, New Hampshire. Yeah, maybe you could start by giving your date of birth, where you were born, and I'd like to hear, to begin with, some background on your family and how your family came here.
Well, I am Edwin.
I'm happy to hold it myself.
Okay, I'm Edwin Chertok. I was born here in Laconia, August 26, 1915. My father, Max Chertok, who was born in the Minsk area of Russia in 1890, came to this country as a 15-year-old boy in 1905 and worked at first in New York City and somehow found his way up into Worcester, Massachusetts, where he met my mother. They were married on Thanksgiving Day of 1914, and that year he had purchased a old second-hand store in Laconia, New Hampshire, and he brought my mother here as a bride of the age of 19 in 1914. And Dad prospered in his business. He had a way of relating to people, and they liked him, and he knew how to extend credit as he built his own credit. And I was the firstborn, 1915. I had a sister, Pearl, who was born in June of 1918, and a brother, Martin, born in May of 1920. And then the surprise of me back in 1935, I had another brother, born Brother Benson, 20 years my junior, who turned out to be one of the leading nuclear physicists in the United States, a college professor, and he had a short life, only lived to be 46. But I've spent my entire life here in Laconia, with the exception of the few months I was in the service in 1945, and I had 4 years at the University of New Hampshire. And the rest of my time was here in the retail business, also being involved in many, many community activities as a native. And I retired from my business in 1980, retired as a Belknap County Commissioner in 1994, and have enjoyed retirement ever since.
When your parents had come from, I think you said near Minsk. Your father, you said, had come from Minsk. Was that?
In the Minsk area.
Yeah. Did he, or your mother, for that matter, did they ever talk about the old country at all?
A little bit. If you're interested in my father's history, it's a fascinating history, and I've written it up and I have it all detailed. But he was the youngest son in a very, very wealthy family. And his mother died in childbirth, and he had a stepmother that he didn't get along with. His father, in this particular area outside of Minsk somewhere, owned the water rights to the river. He owned the dam on the river. He owned the grist mill. He owned the fields on either side, and had many, many people working for him, planting and harvesting the crops. My father told me that the farmers around there would bring their grain or whatever it was, wheat or whatever it was, into habit put through the grist mill, and the wheat would be processed, and if there were 4 barrels, his father kept one as his fee, and he kept these barrels of wheat. When he had enough to make up a full team load, it would be transported into Minsk, and then they would bring back a keg of coin. My father said that in his house there was a separate room which was called the counting room, and in the counting room there were kegs of coin, just like we used to buy kegs of nails years ago. And his father was also the banker in the area. At the age of 8 or 9, the friction between my father and his stepmother was such that he went to live in the city of Minsk with a brother, an older brother. My father had been trained and educated by a rabbi who lived in the house with him, just for the purpose of educating my father. Years later, when I was in college, home one day in the store, he said to me, Sonny, send those rugs back. He says they're not the right color. I went over to a file to look, and I took out a bill of lading. As I stood there looking at the bill of lading, trying to find out where to put the date, he said to me, "What's the matter, college boy? You don't know how to fill out a bill of lading?" He says, "I was doing it when I was 11 years old." I says, "How come?" He says, "Well, I was the assistant American Express agent in Minsk, Russia." I says, "You were the assistant American Express agent at the age of 11? Yes, he says. Yes, he says, because I was educated. I could read and write. He says the trappers would come in with their furs. I would make out a complete receipt, and then I would hold their hand while they made the X. And he pointed out the value of education to me at that particular time. As he got old enough and saved up enough money, he left Minsk for Hamburg, Germany, and then got a boat to the United States. He said, I landed in Ellis Island with 5 cents, and I used that to buy a New York paper so I could learn the language. Years later, after World War II, we discovered one remaining relative of my father's. My younger brother had been over in Europe and discovered this man who'd survived the war. And he came here with his wife. When Mother told him the stories about my father being so poor in New York City, he couldn't understand it. He said his father was such a wealthy man. He said if he'd sent home, he could have sent him all kinds of money. But evidently, in those days, pride or whatever you want to call it, they didn't. And incidentally, my wife's folks had a similar experience. My wife's father, Max Schumann of Salem, Massachusetts, was born in Russia, and his father was a supplier to the Russian army. And Max came to the United States on a pleasure trip as a boy. One of his brothers got married and came to the United States on a honeymoon, and Max and another brother went with him just for the trip. They came back, and then a few years later, Max got himself a Gentile girlfriend in the village, and his father sent him back to the United States for another time just to get away from this gal. And then when they came back, the parents arranged a wedding for him, and he was getting of the age to go into the army, to be conscripted, and he didn't want to go. They didn't want him to go. And, of course, he couldn't get a passport at that time. So he and his wife left with a lot of money, and he and his bride, and they went east. They took this Trans-Siberian Railroad, and they would come to the border, and they'd be turned away. And they went through all these places we read about, Afghanistan and those other particular. And finally, they reached the point where they were able to bribe a guard somewhere at some post. They got in. They ended up in Harbin, China. And he said he met some Chinese Jews at the time. Then they went over to Japan, referred to some people there, and they stopped at a Jewish-Japanese family. It was a Jewish man with a Japanese wife. And, of course, he said it was the strangest thing to see all the sons sitting around the table. They had the Japanese eyes and the Jewish noses, he said. And then he landed in Seattle, Washington, and it came across the country to East Coast, where they had family in Hartford. He ended up in Salem, Massachusetts. But these are interesting stories. I never realized that some of the Jewish people back in the 1890s were really wealthy in parts of Russia. At the same time, they always had to fear the pogroms, because my mother remembered as a child of 5 years old being hidden under the bed when the Cossacks came, and she was put in a trunk by her mother. And the feeling was that the mother had been raped. And this seemed to be a common thing because she said her mother had a miscarriage, and they didn't talk about the fact. But that's just the story of one family.
Yeah.
And of course, this story can be retold thousands and thousands and thousands of times.
Yeah. It was interesting to me hearing you talking about your father's experience with the, these sort of rural people in Russia. When he came to Laconia and settled here, did you get the impression that he found this to be was it a similar experience, or was it very different?
Well, Laconia in the early 1900s, Laconia was settled by what we call the old Yankee families. And perhaps in my speech maybe I didn't put enough emphasis on David Sneerson, who was the first one we know of to settle here, a very religious Jewish man and a very fine man. He a man of good character. And his son, Bernard, told me that some of the old Yankees in the town used to come over and sit with his father at night, and they would discuss the Old Testament. And these people, he said, the children's name of these Yankees, they used Isaac, Isaiah, and biblical names, and they were discussed the similarities, and they got along very, very well. There was a lot of respect between these people. And what happened as Laconia grew, and the mills grew along the river, not only Laconia, but Franklin, the growth has always been along lines of transportation and water power. You take the Connecticut River, and Haverhill, New Hampshire was famous for its growth, one of the first settlements up there near Dartmouth College. That whole area was very flat fields, flooded fields, and the agriculture was good. The Merrimack River, of course, with the tremendous mills and the Amherst mills in Manchester, down through Lowell, that whole area. Well, Laconia had the water power, and they needed workers. And the workers came from Canada. And the Canadian French came down in droves because life was better here than it was on the bare farms up there in Canada. The Canadian French, for the most part, were very religious, but they were more anti-Semitic than the Yankees because of they would refer to the lower educated ones, would refer to the Jews as Christ killers. That was the situation at the time. My father had a way of relating to people, and he treated everybody with respect, whereas the Yankees tended to look down on the French. And there were two furniture stores in Laconia at the time, one big one, a big store, Luigi Robinson Company, one of the most important stores in the Eastern Seaboard. They carried everything, right? Of course, I later bought them 50, 60, 70 years later, but it doesn't matter. At their height, they were a big store. But their clerks would even look down at and the other store was a fellow named O'Shea, who was an Irishman, a good family, but the ones around the furniture store were alcoholics. And so and the French didn't get along with the Irish. So these people would come into my dad's store, and he would treat the French people with dignity, extend credit to them, and his business grew, and it grew fast. And he got along with these people. And he had many of their French people were his buddies. Some of them he'd go fishing with and so forth. They knew him as Mac and Joe, and they got along. He had a way of doing well with people, so he didn't have the problems. That's, And you'll find that I speak of my father. This goes for most of the Jewish people that came to Laconia. They're all warm people for the most part, and they got along with their neighbors. And of course, as far as school was concerned, the teachers liked the Jewish kids because the Jewish kids knew their lessons, they worked at it, and they didn't need the discipline that many of the rough other boys did. See, that's I think I pointed that out.
Yeah,
in
you
my
spoke
mouth.
about. I was going to ask you about these old Yankees and their conversations about the Old Testament, because I think that's really fascinating and nice to think about. Maybe perhaps you could speak a little bit to the your level of Jewish education and. Well, first of all, what that your parents had, and then what was practiced in your home, and so on.
Of course, when Laconia in 1915 to 1925, let's say, the Jewish population was completely Orthodox. It was an Orthodox type service, and they had enough families, about 20 families, so that one very wealthy man, a man named Isaac Sikansky, had bought a Torah, and they kept it in one of the houses, and they would get together for services. And in the early 20s, there were enough people, so they would hire a hall for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The St. Jean the Baptist was a French society. They had a small clubhouse. They would hire that many times. And then Nyssa Pythias had a clubhouse, and they hired that later on. And they would have their services there. When I was in the first or second grade, they hired a rabbi, a man named Mr. Cohen, had a family. He was a rabbi and a shechet. Is that the word? He did he took care of the chickens on Fridays. He killed the chickens on Friday. And he would have meat sent up once a week, kosher meat sent him, and he would then in his back shed, he'd lay it out on newspapers on a table, and the women come and he'd cut it up and sell it to them. And they started a cheder in his house. And so after school we had cheder at 4 o'clock to 5 or something like that, where he prepared the boys and taught the boys and girls Hebrew. Some took to it. Some of us kind of goofed off wherever we could. But that was the attempt of the community to instill Judaism in their children. And when I got to be 12 years old, Mr. Cohen used to come over the house every day, and I'd have to study to get ready for my bar mitzvah. And I had it in August of 1927, I guess, yeah. And then before Cohen came, my mother used to order meat from, it was a butcher in Manchester, Adler, A-D-L-E-R, had a store in a grocery store in Manchester. We sold meat also. And Mother would send down those days, a penny postcard and order a pound of this or 2 pounds of that. He would get it the next day, immediately wrap up whatever had to be sent and send right out parcel post. Mother would have it the following day, and then once a month she would settle up with him. He'd send a bill and she'd send him a money order or a check for it. And that's the way they did business. Of course, I think one of the strengths of the Jewish community throughout the world is the ability to trust each other. Mm-hmm. That's what drove commerce along the eastern seaboard away from the time of the Jews understood what trust was, and they'd always take a chance and trust another one.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you were saying, not just with each other, but as you were saying with these other immigrant groups too. Trust the French Canadians, trust the
That's true. Well, that's in a retail sense, but you take, my father bought a store for $100, and from an Irishman named Dustin. Did you read the story or not? He bought the store, and the agreement was I had the deed, and I gave it to the editor of the paper, and he never gave it back to me. It called for so many holes, and then used this and that. There were very few new things in there. And the agreement called that Dustin would stay with him for a week to teach him the business. The following day, they left Laconia early in the morning. In those days, you took a train out of Laconia, went to Boston. It was a 2-hour ride by train. They got to Boston, and Dustin took them around to introduce him to a few suppliers there in the North Station area. Years ago, there was Henry and Clark, Coleman Levin, a lot of supply houses sold stoves, carpets, old-fashioned, in those days, bench ringers, things that people needed, crockery. And Dad went in, introduced himself, and said, I'm starting in business, but I get a little credit. And he told me Waverly Stillpart gave him a $10 credit limit. Somebody else gave him $15. He said after we visited 4 places, Dustin says, well, I'm going out. I'll see you at the station tonight. He says, Dustin left to go to a bar. He said, I continued going around all these different places, a lot of them, Prescott and Company, old established jobbers. Each place he established, got a little credit, gave him his name, and so they gave him a little credit. He said, when I got to the station, there's Dustin waiting for me with a big cigar. He says, drunk. We got on the train, and Dustin stretched himself out and starts to tell me, he says, young man, he said, winter's coming on, and there's not going to be any business. You're going to get pretty discouraged there this winter, but I'll be back, and I'm going for Florida at the end of this week. He said, but I'll be back in the spring, and I'll buy back the bit. He says, I've done many times before. My dad said to me, I was mad at that Irishman. He says, I was never going to let him buy the business back. He said, when he came in the next door, he said, I told him to get the hell out. He said, we cleaned up the place, and he says, and Dad ran with the business from then on. Yeah, he learned the business, made a lot of mistakes, but he learned it. And of course, one thing he always prided himself on was his credit reputation, because he paid his bills on time. And when he wrote out a check, he had a big signature, and he had a nice Waterman, whatever fountain pen was. And he was so proud of his reputation. And actually, establishing himself in the business, and I think this is true of a lot of furniture men, after they got themselves established, they didn't make the money in the business. They made it in outside deals, getting into real estate or something like that. But anyway, it's been a great trip.
One of the things I was interested in from, I think it was the talk in the video, you mentioned there were some, I don't know, people that sounded like they were kind of characters in the community. There was the story of, what was it, Sikensky?
Isaac Sikensky.
Where they found the hidden money.
Oh, well, it wasn't that much hidden. People knew him. Isaac Sikensky was a character. He was a super junk dealer, let's put it that way. He was here before my father. He came from a part of Russia, and he looked the part. He wore boots. He wore greasy-looking clothes. He wore a cap that was like a black, almost a miner's cap. It was always greasy. He looked very, and his features were real Semitic, a real hook nose, and he had a lot of low-priced tenements. He had a lot of them. He became you might term him a slum landlord, but that is the wrong term, because he took care of these people. They were they needed wallpaper. He'd say, go buy wallpaper. They couldn't pay a week's rent. He'd let them stay, and I was told by some of the older French people, when he first had a house on one of the streets, he had his horse in the barn, and he had a window there, and when people would come in to buy something, the horse would stick his head through the window and be right in part of the house that might have been part of the kitchen and the store. He sold stuff. Later on, he bought another house in one of the ends of town. It was kind of at a fork of the road, And his neighbors all liked him. Very likable neighbors. The many stories about Isaac. One story was told me by a very prestigious real estate man who had once been the manager of the Laconia foundry. And when the foundry went out of business, after the car shop went out of business, this man, Ed Fitzgerald, became a real estate man. And he told me the story of Isaac years before that, going to Laconia Savings Bank one day on a real estate deal. And the Yankee came out ahead of time, and people standing in front of the bank. And you have to realize what life might have been around 1912 or something like that. This fellow comes out, and he has a fistful of money. And he opens his fist like he's opening up a deck of cards. And he announced to everybody out there, well, he says, I just skun a Jew. I skun a Jew. How come? Well, he says, I sold that block across the street to Isaac Sikorsky for $15,000. And he had the $15,000. Well, 2 weeks later, Isaac sold that particular piece of property. It was a chain outfit for $35,000. So he was a very shrewd man. And he used to keep his money in his cap. And when he'd go to pay his bills, he'd take off his cap, and the cash was in there. His tenants would come into our store and buy wallpaper. And the first day of the month, he would come right in to pay he'd have the bill and paid all his bills very, very promptly. He and his wife didn't have any children. They lived in this particular house, and they kept it, well, by today's standards, it wasn't attractive. He had a stove in the kitchen, and sometimes chickens would run around inside the house. But I met Isaac one night as a surprise when I happened to become a Mason. Isaac did the same night. He was there, and that man was dressed to a T. Oh, his clothing and everything was just, the man was a wealthy man, and evidently he used to go to Boston from time to time and either go to Brooks Brothers or some tailor to take care of things. But the man you saw on the street wasn't the same man you'd see at a social gathering. He had had a falling out with one of the Jewish men in the community back in the early 1920s. They were at a social party one night, and these two men got into an argument, Isaac and another man, both strong-willed men, over something or other, a piece of land or something, I don't know what it was. And the fight, they actually came to blows. So much so that one man bit the other one's nose quite severely, and the police had to be called to break it up. And after that, Isaac didn't come to our shul at all. He used to go to Boston for the high holidays. Years later, after my father died, I was drafted and I became president of the temple. And that year I got down, we had Rosh Hashanah services start at 10 o'clock. But the old Orthodox, very religious, would be there earlier. And I'm approaching the temple at about 9:45 when this Mr. Wayne comes out and accosts me. He said, hey, you realize Isaac Sikorsky's in there? I said, well, so what? Fine. He doesn't belong. You kick him out. You're the president. Get him out. He doesn't belong to this show. I said, everyone is welcome in the services. And this was the man that the two had had the battle. And Isaac was in his last few years. And, of course, I didn't kick him out. And the other fellow left for the day. But he, reputation was that during World War I, Isaac, being a very shrewd man, some of the rumors was that he, under the table, paid some of the managers or executives in some of the local mills and sometimes a carload of fresh cotton or something like that might be delivered to the mill, and Isaac might buy it and then sell it to somebody else for junk or something. I don't know what truth it was to it, but he did die a very, very wealthy man. And sure enough, in his kitchen stove, there was $175,000 in paper money inside the stove when the lawyer went over to examine what was there, because his wife had predeceased him.
Were there other characters in the Jewish community that had that kind of a, sort of a very noticeable profile?
Not to that extent. What I think our Jewish community probably was typical of most of them. Why were people here? An opportunity to work, and there's this. Why did people come to Laconia? Because the textile mills all of a sudden got busy. The lumber mills were busy. There were job opportunities. And with the job opportunities, there's always a chance for people in need to sell them goods and services. And our downtown had many Jewish retailers. Some didn't make it, others did. And some of the older people came. They were actually in agriculture. There were some farmers over there in Gilmanton.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because you mentioned.
Yeah, and the one of the big families was the Cameron family, and yet the old man Cameron had a house on Court Street, had his cows in back and all that.
Right in town, in other words.
Right in town, see, in that time, yeah. There was no zoning laws. You have to realize, and yet Cameron's children all were brilliant. They went to school. His sons were very successful. One became a hosiery jobber. Others were in the retail business. The daughters were outstanding teachers. Then they married doctors. The key was these people all insisted that their youngsters get educated. And they took advantage not of the school system and the many, many, many brilliant people. And I say this is Laconia. You could say the same for Franklin. You could say the same for Portland, Maine, and Rumford. This is the history of the Jewish people.
Did that have the effect then of over the years sort of decreasing the number of people in the community as in other words, as the Jewish children went off, let's say to college? Did many of them not come back? I mean, obviously you were one who came back.
Most. I joke about that. The smart ones that did well went away. And those of us who weren't that keen came. No, I knew as a youngster my father's store was a place for me. And a few didn't. The Rosen family, the boys didn't get educated in college. They went through high school. They all stayed in the retail business. But most of them went away and didn't come back. They didn't come back, yeah. And you have to understand, economically, the opportunities are greater where there are more people, especially if you're retailing. If you run a retail store, and you have 100 customers a day go by your door, and you have another retail store where 1,000 people go by, you can both be the same, but the one that has those 1,000 people go by has many more chances. If only one in 100 is going to come in.
Right.
You see, that's traffic, absolutely 10, sure. Yeah. You can take two brilliant furniture men and women, and put them in different locations, and the one that has the most people is bound to do more business if they're both equal in their ability. So that's, and of course those got educated, some became pharmacists. We had perhaps 20 or more merchants in the area, Jewish merchants. And today, there's one I can think of, Bobby Sawyer. There might be two, I can't think of the one. but we had 0 doctors. And when Dr. Brody first came to town, some of the key doctors in this particular community happened to be French, and they were very anti-Semitic. They didn't want him in the hospital. He couldn't practice in Laconia Hospital. He opened up in Belmont a house. He became so successful and so outstanding compared to those others that now there's a part of the hospital named after Dr. Brody. And today, I don't know how many Jewish doctors are in the community. Mm-hmm. You see, doctors, dentists, lawyers, the professions, teachers at the Plymouth College, and this is the change, the second and third generation.
So I was going to ask you this, and you're beginning to talk about it, that in the evolution of the Jewish community here has been in sort of in that direction, so that now what was once primarily a retail community is more, these days, more in the professions. Is that right?
Well,
as you think about the membership today in the synagogue, is that?
Well, membership in the synagogue, yeah. Well, we had a Laconia shoe company come in, the heirs, Gentile people, and Laconia needed industry badly after the old car factory. They made railroad cars in Laconia years ago, in the 1800s all the way through 1926. Foundry built hundreds of freight cars, the Charles to Boston Elevated Railroad. You'll find, if you go to that trolley museum up there in near Kennebunk, the trolley museum, you'll see all kinds of cars made in Laconia, New Hampshire. That was a big industry. And of course, it went out in the 20s because they found they could make railroad cars near the source of the steel and all that out west. And that failed, but Laconia Shoe came in, a Gentile group, and they went broke. Then later on, about 1935 or 36, a couple of Jewish fellows came in from Haverhill, Mass. And started Laconia Shoe all over again. And they had a battle for a few years, ended up becoming very, very successful. Gene Brennus and Irving Selig, and Irving Selig's son is Bob Selig, the present temple. They were employed over 200, and they were a real good factory. They did excellent work until one of their, they were bought by somebody that went belly up after a while, but they contributed a lot to Laconia. They were extremely successful in manufacturing. And now, the makeup of the show, I'm just trying to picture the members. You've got some outstanding real estate people. I mean, the people that sell real estate. You have some that own real estate, not right here in Laconia, but around different places. There are doctors, several, lawyers, dentists, teachers of all kinds, a great mix of population. The treasurer has an executive office with one of the manufacturers down in the Tilton area. So it's pretty diverse. Of course, it's a Reformed temple now. And we attract people. And incidentally, when they have during the summer, they have an event where they serve, on a Sunday, they have a Jewish food and all that. It's amazing the number of Jewish people who come out of the woodwork around here.
For the food.
And during World War II, when Hitler, and we knew that he was starting to exterminate the Jews before it became public knowledge, a committee was formed in the state. And Mr. Machinist of Manchester, New Hampshire, who had one of the big stores in Manchester, machinist, had my father as a co-chairman, and they went around raising money to try to get as many Jewish people as possible out of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And surprised, my father went out in the woodwork, out in the hinterlands around, and he hit up many, many people that we didn't realize were Jewish. Many, many men had married Gentile women
Mm-hmm.
and had become Methodists, Baptists, not Baptists, but congregations.
They'd actually converted.
Yeah, well, I don't know the men converted, but their children. I had two fellows, the grads in Meredith, New Hampshire. One was in my class at university, and our brother was a little older. Very pleasant fellows, but there was some Christian religion. They knew basically they were Jewish. When I was in the lodge, Ben Jacobs, who was married to a French girl, I knew that his father was Jewish, and the last 20 years he's more or less emphasized. He's in Florida and so forth, but he's kind of proud of his heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And they grew up in Meredith, and I dated one of his sisters one time. Never gave a thought that she was Jewish, and I didn't think anything of it.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a transition that's taken place,
Mm-hmm.
people. There were a lot of people here that came, and if you were to get out to the library and look at the memorial plaques of those men who served in World War One, nothing of World War II, but World War One, there were a lot of Jewish names on there, men who lived in the Laconia area.
And they couldn't have been living here for very long before.
No, that's right, yeah. Well, some of them were sons and families, or some of the older families had been here.
Uh-huh.
See, because we probably haven't accounted for all of them. Now, what I'm saying to you about Laconia, it could be said for Franklin, New Hampshire, Claremont, New Hampshire, Dover and Portsmouth and larger extension of. I don't know whether you have any idea how many Jewish people were in this whole New England states during the early 1900s or 18.
Well, I know that you're right because of the, not necessarily those towns, but I certainly have found similar stories in many, many, many communities. Yeah. You a little while ago you'd mentioned one of these farming families. I was interested who were some of the other families that were Jewish families that were farming.
The name was Feuerstein, F-E-U-R, Feuerstein. And I had recollections as a very little child of being bundled up and taken in my father had a Ford truck. I have a picture somewhere. High boarded sides. And we went down to Gilmanton, which is about 12 miles, country roads, and where Abe, the son, was married to this woman who evidently came out of the Cape Cod area as a bride. And his father had the farm there in Gilmanton. Abe later came to Laconia and tried to open up a store. And then he became, he had that rural background, and he became a cattle dealer.
He had a rural background in the old country.
No, in this country. His father may have come from the old country, but he had a rural background being brought up in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, and then he came to Laconia. And he and his wife had 3 children. And the son, Martin Feuerstein, passed away 2 years ago. Martin was an outstanding teacher, a graduate of the University of New Hampshire, an outstanding teacher in the Franklin system, and he served in the state legislature for many terms, a well-liked man. Martin married a daughter of a Jewish farmer in Tilton, New Hampshire, a fellow named Kropp, K-R-O-P-P. And he had a farm right there, right near where the big interstate is right there, exit 20.
Yeah.
As you go toward Tilton, on the right-hand side, big red barn. And I remember going there as a kid at perhaps 14 or 15. They had a big party for something. Once the oldest son, Frank, became a doctor and came back to Franklin, New Hampshire, as a doctor. The other son, Nathan, he was a character. He'd been in the furniture store in Franklin, New Hampshire. Kind of a funny guy, a little abrasive. And then their one daughter, Pauline, married Firestein. She was a graduate of the University of New Hampshire, too. And I think she was a teacher. But I remember they had a big celebration, and Kropp had a barrel of cider that he, and there was a hose, and everybody was siphoning the cider out of the barrel. But a real farmer made a lot of money. See, there were, because there were guys that minded their P's and Q's and were honest. They could make a buck.
Now, I know this was more of a phenomenon before you came along, but I understand that many of the Jewish store owners had gotten their start peddling.
Oh, yes.
What did you grow up hearing about that way of...
My father used to call it canvassing. And he and his friend Harry, as they were younger, they'd go knocking door to door. He said, look, I had to make a living. I was a boy. And of course, they talk about wise guys. He said I had a couple dollars. Go. How much your envelopes are gross? And he thought the fellow would quote me so much a gross. Maybe there were $4 or $5 a gross. He said, I had $2. Well, he says, I can't carry the whole gross with me now. Why don't I'll buy a gross, but why don't I take 3 dozen, that's all I can carry, and I'll give you the $2 or something like that, and take. He said, I'd go out, he says, then I'd go house to house, knock on the doors, and say to the woman, you need any envelopes to send a message to somebody. And I'd sell the envelopes maybe 2 cents a piece or 3, whatever it was. And he says, when I sold the 3 dozen, I had enough money so I could go back and get the rest of them. See, they knew things. He told stories of being an itinerant photographer. And he and his friend Harry, because he knew Block Island and Rhode Island, that was a recreation place for the wealthy in the summertime. Also, he'd been to Mount Washington Hotel up in Bretton Woods. He says, Harry and I would stand there with our camera, and as couples would stroll by, we'd snap a picture. And then we'd give them a card. And then if they came back the next day, we'd have the picture, we'd sell them the picture. He also peddled furs. And these fellows know how to knock on a door and sell. They had to sell to make a living. I graduated college. I'd been working in my dad's store off and on doing things. Ever since high school times, I knew how to do the bookkeeping, stuff like that. I came in, and he gave me one day I came in the store, he said, okay, you're coming to work full-time now. He went and got a mattress sample. You know what a mattress sample is? Section of a mattress. Mm-hmm. Show you how it's made, opened up. Yeah. He said, here, take this, go out and do some canvassing. It's June now, the overnight cabins will be opening up. Go sell them some mattresses. Oh, Jesus, I didn't know how to sell. I went from place to place, knock on the door. Nobody wanted this. You have to have a knack, and these guys had it. They could sell anything. There's one fellow who's passed away years ago, came to Claremont, New Hampshire, and he started selling bedspreads, tufted bedspreads, going house to house. I met him later on in Sarasota, Florida, back in around 1985. He was an extremely wealthy man, and he had helped to underwrite several of the leading political figures in the state. But he started his business peddling bedspreads. My dad, in the 20s, as his business expanded, he had 2 he bought 2 pickup trucks and had 2 men out on the road knocking on door to door, selling. You see, the idea, you go into a woman, here's an item, it's $9.95. All you need is $2 now. I'll be around every week to collect 50 cents.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way they built their businesses.
And they wouldn't just be in, let's say, in a town like this. I mean, they would go farther afield. Would they go into the smaller villages?
Oh, sure, because people didn't have
areas?
transportation.
Uh-huh.
Look, you have to think back when there were no cars. And if they had a horse, the horse was out busy working the field. The peddler came by. The woman needed something. She needed needles. She needed maybe a pan. And he would sometimes take stuff in trade. And look, the peddler was very, very important. Very, very important. And I know you've got my story about meeting Wolf at the Stanford Institute,
right,
Hoover
right,
Institute.
yeah.
And he told a story about his father leaving, going south, never came back.
Mm-hmm.
There was many a Jewish man that went out traveling. He may have been murdered along the way. He may have met some
Started
woman.
a family. Yeah.
You know, this happened, many of them, these stories. And a couple separated for a while. It's easy to break up. There's many a man that left his family.
Yeah. Huh. Question I have about just over the years, I'm also getting the impression that the members of the Jewish community have been really sort of at the center of the civic life in the town. Has that been true? More?
Well, my father would go to important council meetings. There was a time when Laconia Shoe Company was having a rough time at the beginning, and they needed to get some fuel for the winter. They didn't have the money.
Mm-hmm.
And the city council had a meeting, and my father went, and he wasn't particularly friendly with the Brinduses, but he went and said that they had to be helped out at that particular time. During the Depression years, when the car shops went broke, Laconia was hit hard. Mr. O'Shea, who ran the big department store, he was a Dartmouth graduate. His father started the business. His father had come to town when it was the Irish, the old Yankees, but his father was a wool sorter, could sort wool. They needed him. And he lived near the mill, and he had a little chaplain's own house for the Irishmen. And then he started a store, and they prospered, he and his brother's store, and their son went to Dartmouth College, and Arthur O'Shea was very community involved. And they needed to finance a new outfit coming into town. The car shops went broke. The city took all those buildings for taxes, and they formed Laconia Industrial Corporation. And I didn't realize it till later on, 30 years later, I was the president of it. I look back to the history, and there's my father's name as one of the original 7. And but they stayed out of politics in that they didn't. My father was support the Republicans because when his sister was he brought her over from the old country. The quota was full, and they had to go back. And then the local fellow, Charlie Carroll, went to Washington, D.C., saw Senator Moses,
oh, yeah,
and he got him in. And so my father understood the value of politics. And of course, he's very friendly with Styles Bridges, because Bridges was a Kiwanian, became a U.S. Senator. And we ran into, the war came on, all of a sudden our supply of coal, the mill in Pennsylvania was exhausted. Mine was exhausted. And all of the fellows sold us the coal. And he said, Max, I can't sell you any more coal. I don't have it. And we needed a carload of coal. Dad said to me, write to Styles Bridges. I wrote to Senator Bridges and said, I need a source. And this was during the war years. And we were out of coal, and he said, and a wire come right back the next day, a carload of coal on the way. Signed Stiles. He was one of the overseers of the United Mine Workers. He cahoots with John L. Lewis. So the political connections were good. But people didn't develop into politics until I got involved. That was about it. And if my father known it, he'd have turned over in his grave. But
was there a reluctance to do so just to avoid making enemies, or?
Well, for the most part, they're so busy running their own business, they didn't have time for politics. And, you're bound to. The worst thing a retailer would do is be in politics. Because I had some customers come in the store, and the wives would buy from me, and the husbands would, God damn it, I hate to come in here. Because I supported the school board, and they wanted the taxes cut, and you can't cut taxes if you're going to support the school board. So, but at the same time, I was mayor of Laconia.
Oh, I think
1974. The mayor of Claremont, New Hampshire, and the mayor of either Bellows Falls or Rutland was also, the three of us were Jewish and were all in the furniture business. Because the Simmons Company, I was a big beauty rest account, Simmons, they said, we got three of you right now that are mayors, so that the transition took place over time.
And that was you said in the 1970s.
70s, yeah.
Yeah.
And some of in Manchester, of course, there were some very important Jewish people there who ran mills and so forth. They got involved supporting political candidates. Judge Gregg, I'm trying to think of the Jewish man's name, he's well known in the state. He went out and pushed Judge Gregg to get him started as a congressman. And so this man is going to go places, and that's right.
I think this is probably the last question is just as you look back at your life, having grown up as part of a Jewish community in a small town in northern New England. What do you see as the benefits of being in a community like this, as opposed to where the majority of Jewish people live in, the big cities and the big suburbs? I mean, what did you get that they didn't, and vice versa? What do you feel perhaps that you've missed?
I didn't get the ghetto mentality, if that's the way it's. And when I went to University of New Hampshire, I went down and had a room in Fairchild Hall. My roommate was a friend of mine in Laconia. The people across, and I became friendly with everybody on my floor. And I didn't run to find out who the Jewish guys were at the college. And a week or two later, they were starting to rush freshmen. And I was asked to go to the ATO house. And I went to the ATO house and looked, I was asked to go somewhere else, Lambacai or something. I went. And the Jewish guys upset as hell with me. How come you not? They had a little section, one dormitory, where they had 10 rooms together, all in that section. And how come you haven't come down here and been with us and so forth? Well, I didn't feel that particular. Look, my girlfriend's here in Laconia with Gentile.
So the connection was to
see that
people in your community.
Look, I grew up with all these people, and they were my friends. I was a Boy Scout, Congregational Church down there, and hell, Sundays, Boy Scouts used to go open the door of the church. I knew that church backwards and forwards playing there as a Boy Scout. As we got to be 14 years old or 15 years old, they'd have a young people's social Sunday afternoons, or we'd get down there at 4:35 o'clock, boys and girls go in, and a couple of the mothers would make crackers and cheese or something, and something, a little something to drink. We socialized. I socialized all those people. My mother used to go to the prize speaking contests. She went to debating and all that, and she went to the library. She loved our library, and she knew everybody. Remember the women's club and so forth. We didn't have that clique in us. You see what I'm trying to say?
Mm-hmm.
And I did become a member of the Jewish fraternity, and that was my closest friends as time went by. And we were one of the small fraternities at university, yet we had our senior year, only 4 of us were seniors. And Joe Nathanson was the captain of the baseball team. Benny Bronstein, who graduated the year before, was the captain of the basketball team. I was captain of track and cross country. And Mel Zace, who was a football player and a boxer, has got a hall named after him down there because he became a 5-star general.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the people. I've met a lot of Jewish people in Winmore, and they've had good lives in the city and so forth, some outstanding individuals, but it's an entirely different life. Entirely different, I don't know how to... here's, this is a high school picture,
Mm-hmm.
1933,
34.
Okay. This is my sister, incidentally. She was a harpist.
Oh, the harpist. Uh-huh.
But if you look at this picture, there's my brother, who was a violinist. Mary Gazonsky, a violinist. Ed Gazonsky's a violinist here somewhere. Lester Shapiro, who became one of the biggest meat packers in the country, over here is a violinist. These are Greek kids, French kids, Gentile kids, finest orchestra in the state at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the educational system. But when I spoke to Abe Gazonsky's younger brother the other day, Abe just died. And his younger brother was 12 years his junior. He didn't know his older brother had been a violinist. But these are the opportunities in a small town way back then.
Just to mix in with many, many different kinds.
And I don't know
Oops.
This is my sister.
So she had a career.
What?
She had a career as a musician.
Well, this is... I got her obituary written in the New York Times, and her obituary in the New York Times was at the top of the page, and like this. That's a local paper, but you're too young to remember Ed Sullivan's show.
Yeah, I think I came along right around the end of that.
Well, she grew up in Laconia,
Uh-huh.
and the reason she got the harp is she took the piano lessons. Because all the Jewish kids had music. Everyone had piano lessons. And she tried out the high school orchestra, and a better pianist than her got the position.
So she
So she immediately
Picked
went
another
and took up the flute,
Uh-huh.
and she became an outstanding flutist. Then she went to music camp one year,
Uh-huh.
and at music camp, Saul Zeta was there teaching the harp. So she decided to be a harpist, and she became a good. Of course, this is my younger brother.
Yeah, so these little towns were all kinds of,
We're talking about
People were-
one family.
yeah,
But I could, if I took, I could take 10 families like that
yeah.
who produced, well, Louis Bean, the Bean family here in town. The mother had the ability of a good seamstress and knit and all that. And the husband was a religious man. He was quiet, but she did the work. She developed a little story with her oldest son, Louis. He was a student, and when he ended up becoming an economist, and in 1932, when everyone expected Hoover to be reelected, he predicted and that Roosevelt was going to be elected, and the reasons why, and he was right. He had a formula figured out, and he became one of the top executives of the Roosevelt administration. And there are many stories like that of these families. The Sneerson family, the oldest brother became an outstanding brain surgeon way back. The next brother, they worked in the car shops when they got out of high school till they could make enough money to go to college.
And one of them was a judge? Is that the same?
That's later on. That's Bernard, the youngest brother,
Yeah.
much younger, and he became he was a fine boy. Kind boy. Of course, a few guys hated him.
Well, that's what happens when you're
Well,
a lawyer, I think.
You know who hated him? The guy that wanted the guy's guns. We had a guy, Larry Luno, who was the meanest son of a bitch in the town. And if he got in an argument with you, or I was at the country club one day, and two guys having a couple of drinks, a social party. One fellow said something. Larry Luno decked him. Larry Luno had to be my neighbor, and lovely wife, and it was a right-of-way through a house I bought. And one of my friends said, "You ought to buy that right away from Larry." I said, "What's it worth?" "Oh, give him $50. So I saw Larry and I said, "Larry, I'd like to straighten out my line. And I'd like to buy that 10 feet there, straighten out my line." "Well," he said, "I guess so." So I said, "What do you want?" He said, $700. I said, $700? "Yeah," he said, he said, "I could sell my house for a funeral home, and that'd make a good driveway if they cut through your land." I went back and saw my friend who was a Chrysler dealer, and I says, "He wants $700. He says, "Sonny," he says, "pay him. Pay the son of a bitch," he says, "and get it as soon as you can." I did, and got it. He was a mean guy. So he goes into Sneerson one day, and he says, "I want to sue such and such." And Sneerson says, "Okay, Larry." Look, he says, "I can settle that." He says, "You're a little run. Look, we can settle it. I can arrange it, and you split it up." He says, "The hell with you. I don't want you. I want a lawyer. I want that guy's guts." He was the type, that's it. And Sneerson was the kind of guy that would tell things nicely. Oh, boy, he'd handle things nicely. He had that. And he was a fine man. Oh, principal man. Yeah, everyone liked him.
Well,